Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the concurrent session number 5, which is Threatened and Endangered Species. My name is John Neisted. I am the travel coordinator for Arizona Ecological Services for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I would like to let everyone know that this session is being recorded. For our first presentation, we have 2 presenters in a tag team. Andy DeVolder, who is a biologist for the branch of listing policy and support in the Ecological Services program at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services headquarters. And also Craig Aubrey, who is the chief of the Environmental Review Division in Ecological Services at headquarters. It's Craig's job to help establish policy and oversee staff addressing issues related to the service's review of federal projects. Andy and Craig will be revisiting the Endangered Species Act regulations revision. So please take it away, Andy and Craig.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon. My name is Andy DeVolder, and I'm speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Manahoac tribes in Northern Virginia. And our goal today with this session is to provide an overview of 5 separate ESA related rules that the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service expect to be proposing later this year and into early next year. And so I'm going to stop sharing my video and then share my screen for some slides. All right, so the reason why we're revisiting some of our ESA implementing regulations was the issuance of Executive Order 13990 in January of this year, which directed all federal agencies to review rules issued under the prior administration that conflict with this administration's national objectives and priorities, including improving environmental regulations. A fact sheet that supported the executive order listed the 5 ESA regulations that the services were required to review, and we will discuss those today. So the 5 rules that we'll provide an overview of today, starting with the most recent, are the Fish and Wildlife Service only regulations on exclusions from critical habitat, the joint regulatory definition of habitat, the Fish and Wildlife Service only removal of the blanket 4D rules for threatened species, the joint listing and critical habitat regulations, also known as the 424 regulations, and finally the joint Section 7 regulations. So during this session, we'd like to provide a quick recap of each of these rules, where we are in the process of revisiting each of them, what types of information might be helpful for us to get from you all through the process, and how we hope to engage with tribal nations throughout the process. And at the end, we'll provide some points of contact so you can reach out to us on these rules and answer any questions you might have after the session today. So the first of the 5 rules we'll be discussing today is the Fish and Wildlife Service only proposal to rescind the final regulations for exclusions from critical habitat that published on December 18th of last year. And that final rule created a credible information standard that applies to information submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service for purposes of evaluating exclusions from critical habitat. It directs that the weights of impacts are assigned based on who has the relevant expertise. It provided additional considerations for exclusions of federal lands. It indicated that the secretary shall exclude areas when the benefits of exclusion outweigh those of inclusion, and provided a non-exhaustive list of other relevant impacts to consider in the exclusion process. So at this point, the Fish and Wildlife Service has drafted a proposed rule to rescind the December 2020 final rule, and we're targeting a publication in the Federal Register in the fall of this year. And at that time, we're going to open up a public comment period. If the proposal is made final, the Fish and Wildlife Service would return to implementing the joint 2016 exclusions policy and the regulations at 50 CFR 424.19, both with the National Marine Fisheries Service. So when we open up for questions at the end, one thing to think about is how, if finalized, would the return of the Fish and Wildlife Service implementing the exclusions policy and the 424.19 regulations affect tribal interests. So the next rule I want to provide an overview of is the habitat rule. So also in December of last year, this is a joint rule. The services finalized a definition of the term habitat as it applies to critical habitat designations under Section 4 of the ESA. And that definition is shown on the screen, and that reads as, for the purposes of designating critical habitat only, habitat is the abiotic and biotic setting that currently or periodically contains the resources and conditions necessary to support one or more life processes of a species. So the services have reviewed this definition, and we have drafted a proposed rule to rescind this final definition from last December. We had developed this definition of habitat to address the 2018 Supreme Court ruling that held that an area must be habitat for a species in order for that area to meet the narrower definition of critical habitat. However, the Supreme Court decision did not require the services to develop a regulatory definition of habitat, and we now intend to propose to rescind that final regulation. And we're targeting a publication in the Federal Register of, again, fall of this year. And once published, public comment period will be open, and we'll be accepting comments on that proposed rescission. And again, with the previous reg, the question to think about is how, if finalized, would rescinding this rule affect tribal interests? All right, and moving on to the third overview of rules. This is the blanket 4D rules. Again, this is the Fish and Wildlife Service only regulation. In 2019, the service finalized a rule that pertains to 4D rules issued under the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act contains a list of prohibitions under Section 9 that are applied to all endangered species. In the 1970s, the Fish and Wildlife Service developed regulations that applied those Section 9 prohibitions for endangered species to all species that were listed as threatened species. And we call those regulations the blanket rules. In 2019, the Fish and Wildlife Service finalized regulations that discontinued the use of those blanket rules for all newly listed species listed or reclassified as threatened. This change only applied to species listed after the effective date of that 2019 rule. So none of the species listed in the past as threatened that may have invoked blanket rules were affected. Since the final rule became effective, the Fish and Wildlife Service has issued species-specific 4D rules for all species listed or reclassified as threatened species. And it's our intention to reinstate the blanket rules, which would automatically apply the majority of the Section 9 prohibitions afforded to endangered species to any species listed or reclassified as threatened. And we anticipate to propose this regulation change in the spring of 2022. Again, a question to think about, how, if finalized, would reinstating the blanket 4D rules affect tribal interests? All right, and the fourth rule is a joint rule issued in 2019, and it revised several provisions in the ESA implementing regulations in 50 CFR 424. And those revisions address two main areas: listing delisting, and reclassifying a species, and the designation of critical habitat. With respect to the listing, delisting, and reclassification provisions, that 2019 rule established a regulatory framework for the term foreseeable future, which is a phrase used in the ESA's definition of a threatened species. This framework describes how the services interpret and apply the phrase foreseeable future when determining whether a species is a threatened species. The rule also clarified that the standard for listing and delisting of a species is the same. Both decisions require us to evaluate the status of the species in terms of the 5 factors that are laid out in Section 4 of the ESA. And the rule also removes specific language from our regulations stating how we do not refer to economic and other impacts in our listing classification decisions. And removing this language from our regulations, however, the services did explain that we would continue to make our listing decisions solely based on the best available scientific and commercial data. And with respect to critical habitat aspects of the 2019 rule, the rule revised the set of circumstances when designation of critical habitat may not be prudent. The ESA requires us to designate critical habitat for threatened and endangered species when we list them, unless there is a determination by the Secretary that such designation would not be prudent. The rule also revised the process and standards for designation of unoccupied critical habitat. The ESA allows us to designate habitat that's currently occupied by a species at the time it's listed, as well as unoccupied critical habitat if that habitat is determined to be essential to the conservation of the species. And lastly, the rule made minor changes to the definition of the term physical and biological features, which was already defined in our regulations. So the status of this one is that the services are in the early stages of reviewing this 2019 rule to determine whether and what provisions to revise. We have, however, decided that as part of the revisions, we will reinstate the language indicating that we will not refer to possible economic or other impacts of potential listing when making listing decisions. Discussions and work on this rule are still in the very early stages, but we hope to have a proposed rule drafted and published by early 2022. So again, key questions as we move forward in our review of this rule and make decisions about potential revisions. We'd like to hear whether there are certain aspects of the 2019 rule that you would like to see revised, or alternatively, whether there are certain aspects of the 2019 rule that you would like to see retained. So now I'm going to turn over to Craig, who will provide an overview of the 5th and final rule that we'll be discussing today.
Hello, everybody. The next set of slides addresses the Section 7 regulations from 2019. We'll start by providing an overview of the 2019 revisions, including the general areas that the revisions addressed, and briefly discuss our upcoming efforts to revise the regulations. Many of the changes that were included in the 2019 revisions for the Section 7 regulations serve to incorporate how consultation has been implemented over the past several decades. The first area we'll mention is related to some of the definitions related to Section 7 consultations. In the 2019 regulations, we revised or added definitions for destruction or adverse modification, effects of the act, and effects of the action. We also established a standalone definition for environmental baseline, as well as a more detailed definition for programmatic consultation. We also addressed the topic of mitigation, addressing some issues proposed by action agencies related to how certain of their activities were to be implemented. With respect to the definition of destruction or adverse modification, we deleted the second sentence. Go back, Andy, please. Okay. We deleted the second sentence of the 2016 regulation while adding the clarifying additional phrase "as a whole" to clarify the appropriate scale of destruction or adverse modification determination. With respect to the definition of effects of the action, we collapsed the terms direct, indirect, interrelated, and interdependent. We included the phrase "consequences to the listed species or designated critical habitat" in the definition of effects of the action, in part to avoid using the term effects to define effects of the action. We clarified the regulation that in order to be considered an effects of the action, a consequence is caused by the proposed action if it would not occur but for the proposed action and is reasonably certain to occur. And we created the new 402.17 to help determine effects of the action. We also established a standalone definition for environmental baseline in order to make it clear that environmental baseline is a separate consideration from the effects of the action. And this new definition clarifies the consequences of ongoing agency activities or existing agency facilities that are not within the agency's discretion to modify are included in the environmental baseline. And we define programmatic consultation in the regulations and discuss different types of programmatic consultations within the final rule. With respect to addressing certainty of mitigation proposed by action agencies or federal agencies, we revised the regulations to support our belief that if the federal agency provides information in sufficient detail for us to meaningfully evaluate the effects of measures proposed to avoid, minimize, or offset adverse effects, services are entitled to rely on that information as proposed. Slide, please. We made a number of other revisions to clarify the consultation process, such as establishing a 60-day time limit to respond to a federal agency's complete request for concurrence that their actions not likely to adversely affect listed species or critical habitat. We inserted a new provision, expedited consultation, into 402.14 to offer opportunities to streamline consultation, particularly for actions that have minimal adverse effects or predictable and straightforward effects based upon previous consultation experience. In order to use this process, though, there needs to be mutual agreement between the services and the federal agency to enter into the process. And the action agency or federal agency needs to provide all the information necessary to initiate consultation. Clarified information needed to initiate consultation. One of the biggest issues affecting consultation timeframes is our ability to get sufficient information to complete consultation. And so this revision was intended to help address that issue. And we clarified the analytical steps services undertake when we're developing our biological opinion in a manner that's consistent with our existing approaches and the revisions we are making to the definition of effects of the action. Slide, please. We also clarified that reinitiation of consultation applies to all Section 7A2 consultations and not just formal consultations. And this was to get consistent with court rulings and existing practice. And we eliminated the need to reinitiate consultation on certain land management plans, those developed by the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, upon listing of new species or designation of critical habitat, consistent with the FY18 Omnibus Bill. One exception from the Omnibus Bill is that we expanded the exemption from just ONC lands to all BLM lands. And the this particular regulatory change addressed issues arising under the Ninth Circuit's decision in Cottonwood Environmental Law Center versus US Forest Service, which I think a lot of people just know as Cottonwood. We also allow the services to adopt all or part of a federal agency's initiation package or our analysis and findings that are required to issue a permit under Section 10A in our biological opinions, thereby trying to help streamline the process. Next slide, please. So, status. In June of this year, we announced that we are initiating rulemaking to revise the 2019 rule. And here's the specific language from the announcement. We said we would propose to revise the definition of effects of the action and associated provisions to portion of that rule, so 402.17, with other potential revisions also under discussion. And so basically where we are right now is we're still kind of working through what the exact scope of the rule would be and the exact language that would go into it. And like I said, I think we said earlier, this was a joint rule with National Marine Fisheries Service. The target publication date for the proposed rule is early 2022. Next slide. And so I think where we've been looking for kind of feedback from folks are there any aspects of the rule, the 2019 rule, people would like to see revised and why? And in particular tribes? And are there aspects of the 2019 final rule you'd like to see retained? Slide. And with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Andy.
Thanks, Greg. So just to kind of as a wrap up, here are the 5 rules that we're working on currently. And as we mentioned, we expect that the exclusions regulation, the first one there will propose sometime this fall. Same for the definition of habitat, which is a joint rule with National Marine Fisheries Service. The standalone Fish and Wildlife Service rule for 4D regulations, we are targeting a spring publication for proposed rule to revise that one. Maybe a little bit earlier to propose the revisions for the listing and critical habitat regulations, which again is a joint reg. And then as Craig mentioned, section 7 regulations, we're targeting a publication to revise those in early 2022. So we'd like to hear your input, and here is a way to do that. And I think what we can also do is provide a PDF of this presentation to the organizers of this and get that in your hands that way. So here are some points of contact. We'll leave this up for now, I guess, and open it up for questions if there are any.